Okay. Well, thank you, Dario, for that fabulous introduction to what the Euro Challenge is all about and the prizes and the opportunities. Before I get started with my presentation, I just want to let everyone know how wonderful this competition is. I've been affiliated with it for, I guess, about 15 years, and it is one of the most rewarding activities that my students have done in terms of research, presentation, collaboration. So it's a win-win regardless of whether you ultimately, get the monetary prize or not. So with that, my challenge today is to walk you through the first part of the challenge and give you some tips and information about what is needed in the first part, which is to describe the current situation in the Euro area. So just as a reminder, the Euro area is the 19 states of the European Union that use the Euro as their currency. It's an interesting factoid that the Euro area's population is about 340 million, which is comparable to the US. The first challenge, part of the challenge, requires you to look at a minimum 3 economic indicators. You can choose to look at more, but these 3 must be in your presentation. Gross domestic product, unemployment, and inflation. So the first indicator is gross domestic product. And the technical term of gross domestic product is the market value of all the final goods and services that are produced in a country in a particular time period. So that's a mouthful. But the components of GDP are important. So components would be personal consumption expenditures, things that you spend, food, clothing, shelter. That's one component. Then the second component is business investment. That would be investment in tools, machinery, technology. The third component is government spending, and that would be things such as government spending on the military, on the courts, on Environmental Protection Agency, things like that. That's about 17% of our GDP in the United States. It varies across countries. And then the fourth component is the amount that a country exports minus the amount that a country imports. So these are the components that go into the GDP numbers that you're going to be working with. So how do we use it? Well, we use it because it allows countries, governments to compare it to previous years. Is there a growth in the economy or is there a contraction? We can compare policy changes. For example, with COVID, there was a lot of stimulus spending on the part of governments to help people through this time. So did it work? And then the third thing that we use it for is to compare across countries, to see whether a country is relatively better off than another. Now, when you do that sort of comparison, it's better to do gross domestic product per capita, meaning you're going to divide the gross domestic product by the population, because that allows you to compare per person what the GDP looks like. It's inappropriate to compare the GDP of the United States to the GDP, let's say, of Belgium, which is a smaller country. So you want to divide by the population to make that comparison more relevant. So now we're going to look at how you measure growth or contraction over time. So it's in my classes, since I teach math as well, it's a percentage change. And so the formula would be the current year's GDP minus the previous year's GDP over the previous year's GDP times 100. Now, that's a mouthful. Sometimes a better way to say it is new minus old over old times 100. So that allows you to come up with the percentage change in GDP. Now, if that number is positive, the economy is expanding or growing. If that number is negative, the economy is contracting or in a recessionary period. So right now, economies are coming out of COVID, so they're growing, they're expanding. The other thing to make sure you're aware of is the difference between real and nominal GDP. So nominal GDP measures GDP, or the C plus consumption, investment, government, and net exports in current prices. It does not account for inflation. So you're going to add up all the things that are being produced in the economy in a particular time frame and in current dollars. Now, since many countries are going through an inflationary period, it's inappropriate to use nominal measures. What you want to use are real measures. And real measures are expressed in a constant or unchanging dollar. They use a base year, so all you're looking at is the actual change in output and not the change in prices. And that's key. You don't want to attribute an increase in GDP to growth if it's only due to price increases. And as I said, it's adjusted for inflation. So make sure when you're using or collecting the information, you're collecting real GDP. So here we have a graph. This is called a time series graph that looks at GDP growth rates. It's over the previous quarter. It's a percentage change. And on this graph, there are three areas that are being represented: the US, the European Union, and the Euro area. And as you can see, through 2016 through 2019, all three of those lines are pretty indistinguishable from one another. So the growth rates were not that different, not very strong. They were pretty flat, if you will. And then COVID hit, and you can see the big contraction in all three areas. The EA and the EU contracted a little bit sooner than the US because lockdowns happened earlier in those regions. And then all three regions rebounded in Q3 of 2020. And the US didn't rebound as much as the other two regions. And then there was a contraction again as we went into more last winter, more lockdowns and more restrictive activity. So now another way to look at GDP is to do a cross-sectional analysis. And a cross-sectional analysis looks at a snapshot at a point in time and then compares the countries. And so you can see there's a lot of variation in GDP growth rates across the EA. The 19 countries of the EA are represented in the blue. The EU average is the red, and then the EA average is the light green. So Luxembourg actually contracted in the third quarter, whereas Ireland had a fabulous growth rate of a little over 6%. Now, again, this is due to the rebounding from COVID as economies reopen. The third way that you could look at this is this is also a time series, but it collapses the information and just looks at annual growth rates. And so this is from 2017 through 2021. And you can see that there's a lot of information here. It's a fabulous graph in the sense that the bar graphs compare the Euro area to the US, and the line graphs are three different countries within the EA. So historically, the EA and the USA, their growth rates over the past number of years have ranged around 2% or so. The US was a little bit better in 2018 and 2019. And then you see the big contraction again in 2020 and 2021 is an estimate since we're not through with 2021 yet. I want to just mention that when you collect this data, you should be going to Eurostat or to the OECD because they have a lot of the information that you're going to need and to pull down. All right, here we are. The second indicator is unemployment. And unemployment is the share of the labor force that is not working but actively looking for work. So I want to just expand on that. As I said, it's the percent of the people in the labor force who want a job but are not working. So who's in the labor force? That's important. The people that are in the labor force are at least 16 years old. They have to be able and willing to work. Can't be institutionalized, and they're not in the military, in school full-time, or retired. So that labor force, make sure you understand who's in the labor force and who's not when you look at those unemployment rates. Now, there's another measure that is important as well. It's called the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is, you take the labor force in the numerator, and then you divide it by the total civilian non-institutional population. And that's important because that number will pick up people that have dropped out of the labor force because they're discouraged or they've decided that, you know, COVID has created childcare problems. So I would suggest that particularly if you're looking at the labor force or unemployment as one of your challenges, to include the labor force participation rate because it has very, very important information. Now I'm going to talk about three types of unemployment that you'll be familiar with as you go through your investigation of unemployment. Frictional is the type of unemployment that, let's say you get out of college and you're looking for a job. It takes time to find a job. So frictional unemployment picks that up. People switch jobs at times in their lives for various reasons. So that's a measure of a very dynamic economy, that when people feel that they can quit a job and then get another job, that's just a churn or dynamism of the economy. The second type of unemployment is structural, and that also is an example of dynamism in an economy. Structural changes are things such that we don't need the same jobs that we did, let's say, 50 years ago. Manufacturing jobs often are being replaced by robots, AI, et cetera. So those people that have lost jobs due to changes in the structure of the economy, and they may take a while to find a job, but that again, that's a measure of dynamism, that as the economy advances, we're creating new and better ways to do things. The third type of unemployment is cyclical, and that's the one that is caused by a contraction or a contraction in real GDP. We right now have experienced a cyclical unemployment due to COVID. A very, very significant drop in our GDP. And that's the one that policymakers try to manage through fiscal and monetary policy. So just as a summary, the unemployment rate and our GDP are inversely relating, meaning that unemployment rises when our GDP is slowing, meaning that as companies start to recognize that there's not demand for their products, they start to lay off people, output slows, and unemployment picks up. On the flip side, when we come out of a recession, we're starting to expand, output is starting to increase, and in order to produce that output, you need more workers. So therefore, the unemployment rate goes down. There's another term that you may want to familiarize yourself with. It's called the natural rate of unemployment. And so that is the unemployment rate that exists when the economy is healthy and growing. Please note that no economy should have zero unemployment, because that would suggest that there's not churn, that things are kind of stagnating. So this natural rate includes both frictional and structural unemployment, but it doesn't include cyclical. So the natural rate of unemployment is also known as when you are at full potential, when you're hitting the potential GDP. The number is not cast in stone. It's a range. It could be from 2 to 3%, 2 to 4% in the US. In the Europe, it may be a bit higher. And that is related to some of the employment contracts and unemployment benefits related to the EEA and Europe. So now let's look at the unemployment rate. Here we have quarterly unemployment rates that are seasonally adjusted, meaning that we adjust unemployment rates because there's a seasonality of certain jobs. Construction in the northern regions is going to slow down just because of the cold weather. And you don't want the winter months to show an uptick in unemployment and be concerned when it's just due to the seasonality. So as you can see, this is another time series graph going back to 2016. Unemployment in the US is typically lower than it is in the EA and EU. But they track pretty closely. They were kind of on a slight downward trend up until the pandemic. And you can see that there was a real spike in unemployment in the US related to the fact that with the closures, firms laid their workers off and then they applied for unemployment benefits. In Europe, there's less of a tendency to lay people off. They will typically keep employees on the payroll, but will be subsidized with government assistance. So there's not that that separation of your workers from the employer rather. Then as the US reopened, you see this downward trend in unemployment. And continuing downward trend. And now unemployment in the US is slightly lower than it is in the EA and the EU. Here again, it's always helpful to look at a cross-sectional analysis and see how your country that you choose stacks up against other countries in the EA. So Netherlands had a relatively low unemployment rate, less than 4%, whereas Spain was topping 14% in Q3. A rather large range here from the lowest to the highest. Now, here is another time series analysis. Again, lots of information with the bar graphs representing the difference in annual unemployment rates in the EA and the US, with the EA being significantly higher than the US. And then the last year, we still have the EA being significantly higher, but that's a projection. So that's from the IMF. That's the projection of what they believe the unemployment rate will be for 2021. It's interesting to note that in 2020, the annual unemployment rates in the US and the EA matched one another. They were just pretty close. It's also interesting to note that Germany, who historically has had significantly lower unemployment rates than other countries within the EA. You can see it tracked here. Italy, higher than France, but tracked pretty closely. You know, they're pretty highly correlated with one another, but Italy diverging a bit at the end of 2021. All right, the third indicator that I want to address is inflation. And inflation is an increase in the general level of prices over a certain time period. It doesn't mean that all prices go up in the same amount at the same time. It's just a general increase. And it's expressed as a percentage change, just as GDP growth is expressed as a percentage change. So how does the EA measure inflation? Their consumer price inflation is measured by the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, called the HICP. It's consumer prices. Now, make sure that you recognize the difference between consumer price inflation and producer price inflation. Producer prices would be input costs, which may be different than consumer price. It's food, energy, clothing, transportation, things like that will get picked up in EA HICP. So as I said, it measures the changes over time in prices of these goods and services in the EA. So inflation, know that inflation, a little inflation is fine. Because over the past 30 years or so, inflation has been running, you know, less than 2% for the most part. But too much can erode purchasing power of consumers. And one of the problems when, you know, if you anticipate inflation being about 2%, you can make decisions based on it. But if inflation starts to pick up significantly and it's not transitory, such as now, we're not really sure whether this inflation is going to be transitory. It makes people's decisions a lot more difficult. So it's really important to keep inflation anchored around a number. And the ECB targets 2% inflation. That is their inflation target. They want prices to rise 2% a year. Now, it's important to note that that 2% target is different than the US. The US has a symmetric target around 2%. So they're okay, the central bank in the United States is okay with inflation running a little above and a little beneath, but on average, they want it at 2. So that symmetry of the target is different than the ECB target, which is 2%. Now, high inflation, which we're experiencing now because inflation is running well in excess of 2% across both the EA and the US, occurs when the economy is overheating. But here it's the conundrum that we have is that inflation is picking up, but unemployment is still high. So we're not sure that the economy is overheating above potential. But what's happening is that there are, as we come out of COVID, there are demand pressures because people now want to spend more. They want to go back to going to restaurants and traveling. So that's a demand push. But at the same time, we have these supply issues that are restricting the amount of output that is being produced. Factories were offline for a while. There's the supply chain issues, getting the products from the producer to the consumer. So there's a lot of both demand and supply are pushing up on prices before we're really back to potential. On the flip side, over the past 10 years, there were times, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, that we were experiencing deflation, which is a general decrease in prices, which means that consumers will postpone purchases, thinking that if prices are declining, why buy now? Because if I wait a little bit, the price will go down. And that's very difficult to deal with on a policy level. So inflation, too much is not good and too little is not good either. So make sure that you understand who is helped and who is hurt by inflation as you go into this competition. People that are helped by inflation are those that borrow money at a fixed rate because they pay that borrowed money back in cheaper dollars. People who are hurt by inflation are those who earn fixed incomes and people who lend at a fixed rate. Because if you lend at a fixed rate and then inflation is picking up, when you get your money back, the dollars that you get back or the euros that you get back will not buy as much as it used to. All right, so here are the annual inflation rates, October of 2021. Again, there's a fairly large degree of variation in this cross-sectional analysis. Malta at the bottom and Lithuania with inflation above 8%. So again, when you do your analysis, see how your country is stacking up against these other countries, and recognize that, this is one of the great things I feel about Euro, is that the Euro challenge is that the world is changing, and as you go through this competition, what's happening is not set in stone. So you have to be very facile in your research so that when new data come out, you incorporate it into your presentation. Here are the annual inflation rates in 2017 through 2021. Again, the US, as you can see in the Euro area, from 2017 through 2019, the EA was not hitting the target rate. They were well beneath it. The US was around 2, a little beneath 2, so kind of symmetric, if you will. And then in 2020, during the lockdowns, actually the EA went into a slight deflationary period. The US, their inflation rate just declined to a little more than 1%. You can see the projections for 2021 are that inflation is going to be well in excess of the target for both the EA and the US. Superimposed again are the 3 countries, France, Germany, and Italy. They do have differences in their inflation rate, but they tack pretty closely. So they're pretty highly correlated with one another. Know that as we go through this competition, in the United States, the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has ceased indicating that he feels that inflation at this point is transitory and due to just the reopening of the economy. And so there's some activities that the Central Bank of the United States will undertake because of the concern about inflation. Within the ECB, as of the date of this recording, which is December 3rd, there still is the belief among the members of the European Central Bank that inflation is transitory and due to COVID. So I wish you the best of luck with this competition. Again, it is an amazingly fun competition. You will learn a lot. You will remember it always. And with that, I bid you good luck.